Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 125th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Fiona Spellman with us today. Hello, Fiona.
Hi there.
Yeah, are you at home in Yorkshire somewhere?
I'm not actually. I'm in a co-working space in a particularly claustrophobic little booth. So there's a few inches either side of me and a little door. They like to be very vociferous in discouraging meetings in these spaces. So I'm in a very small box that I'm speaking
That's
to you
amazing.
from now.
It's amazing. It gives the image of a vast space. I don't know why. Anyway, how are you, Stan?
I'm good today. Yeah, good.
Yeah,
That's,
and we're wearing our poppies today as it's
yeah.
Armistice Day. I have to say also it's my wife's birthday, the 11th of the 11th. So happy birthday to Arlene Norris. So I won't reveal age or anything like that. But anyway, maturing nicely, I think is one way of describing it.
That's terrible.
Is it? I thought that was a compliment.
You
Fiona,
might want to edit that out,
hold
Frank. I'm
on.
not
Should we
sure.
start the program again?
Yeah. Sounds like
Anyway.
either a piece of meat or a bottle of wine.
Okay, well, quickly moving on. It's been, it is a time when there's sadly a lot of quite depressing stuff going on. But actually, what we're going to try and do this week is, as we normally do, is just try and focus on three or four issues and see, and hopefully, people who watch and listen will find it of interest. So, before we move on, I mean, Fiona, there may be probably quite a few people who don't actually know who you are and how we know each other. So do you want to just do a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Fiona Spellman, and I am the chief exec of the Shine Trust, which is a organisation that funds work led by teachers across the north of England, all about creative and innovative approaches to improving the attainment of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Prior to that, I was a teacher, initially up in Moston in Manchester and then down in North London. And I came to Shine in 2011. So I've been with the charity now for just over 11 years.
Wow. And also you do some awards, don't you? You have a sort of fund that encourages innovation in the classroom. I think, is that open at the moment? I think you're looking for nominations at the moment.
It is absolutely, yeah. So we back of teachers who often have sort of quite an early stage idea. They might be trying it with their children in their own classroom, and they might want to sort of try it out at a slightly more developed scale. We provide grant funding to sort of help get those ideas off the ground, and then we will provide funding and support to help ideas that are really working to scale up. So Shine's always believed in the power of teachers who often really know and understand the needs of the children in their care, but sometimes in the school system there's not always very much resource or time to put into new innovations or ideas, and so Shine really focuses on that and backs teachers who are, we think, closest to the issues and often the best placed people to come up with the solutions.
So how much funding is there available for sort of the successful projects? Because I think last year, the last time I saw, there were about sort of 12 to 15 projects that you supported. How significant is that funding, and what can they use it for?
So the funding initially is up to 25,000 over 2 years. So that's the kind of entry point, if you like, for the programme. But then following that, there's funding available to help develop and scale those kind of initiatives. So there's not an upper limit on funding. Typically, our grant size will vary between sort of 10 and maybe up to 100, 200,000, depending on the scale and nature of what it is that teachers are developing. But initially, it's really about sort of testing that early stage and being really clear that when teachers are trying things out in their classroom, they often don't recognise the innovation in their own practice, and often they need to learn and test things as they go. So we're not looking in that sense for finished products. We're not looking for things that have got a 10-year study behind them. We're really looking at that sort of early stage innovations and how we can get new ideas off the ground.
I think
Fiona, we used to find that some of the schools that were written off because they were either in a category or had high levels of disadvantage in the school, often had some of the most innovative practice, particularly those that had been in special measures. And because people had written off the school, nobody looked at the really good practice that was going on, better than some of the outstanding schools, to be honest. Now, we did a scheme when I was in Lancashire, which was schools being recognised for best practice, good practice, and innovative practice. The costs were I think the thing that finally killed it, but the heads themselves were the referees, if you like. The cases were submitted to a panel of head teachers, and they decided, yes, this was worth an award. No, that's not worth an award. I don't know if it's still going, but if it is, it will be a nice set of data for you to look at, particularly on the innovative schools.
Absolutely. I think it sounds really interesting, Stan. I think often there isn't sort of the support around them, some of those and the recognition, as you say, of there might be teachers or sort of groups of teachers who are doing really interesting and innovative work even in the toughest circumstances. And I think for those teachers, often quite a lonely experience, being sort of, if you like, doing that work and feeling very under recognized. And one of the things that we find often with that program is that when teachers apply to us, and especially if they're successful, they almost always start off that relationship by saying, I never thought in a million years that I would be chosen. I never thought in a million years that what I was doing would be recognized in this way. And I think that says a lot about the recognition that teachers actually feel for the work that they do. And I think looping back to Frank's sort of started point, there is a lot of bad news around at the moment. There's a lot of things that teachers are reading and seeing that are deeply worrying. And I think for me, the sort of space that I think is so motivating about Shine is that it's really focusing on what can be done, in the context, and what are the things that can make a difference. Not to in any way minimize the extent to which it's tough out there, but there are really incredible people working in the education system today doing amazing work. And I think sometimes in all of the negative stories, many of which I share those sort of concerns around, we lose sometimes that celebration of the work that is going on and that is really effective. So I think that sounds like a really interesting model. And I think to have something in the system that recognizes innovation and recognizes the people who are going above and beyond and making an impact in the toughest circumstances, to me feels like a real missing sort of link, really, that could help to champion and celebrate the in a sense doing the job in the toughest circumstances. Is that the old adage, isn't it? Necessity breeds innovation, right? You innovate in response to a problem, and actually that's sometimes where the strongest innovations lie.
What we often found the hardest was recognizing that innovation in some schools was current practice in others, and getting sort of some of the heads who were the judges to accept that, but no, this is real innovation for this school.
It's brave innovation, isn't it? It's slightly against the flow,
and they'd say, well, we've been doing that for years. Yeah, but this is in a different context, something that's challenging for them, and they found a way to do it. So it should, we should recognize it as a piece of innovation.
Absolutely, and all of this stuff exists in a context, doesn't it? And that's where one of the things about all of this is that you've got to recognise what the context is in which the teacher's working, and in that sense, what's innovative in one environment may not be in such the same way elsewhere. And I think you're absolutely right that it's got to be, that context has got to be at the heart of how you sort of assess these sorts of ideas.
Now, talking of context, as I know there's another bit of work that Shine do that I'd like you to sort of just explain. You've been doing some place-based initiative work in North Birkenhead. Don't know if you want to just give a little bit of a summary as to why you're doing that, how you're doing it, and what are the early signs on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So
hang on. There, we just lost you for a minute there. So say that sentence again.
So this came about as a result of a conversation between Shine and the Steve Morgan Foundation around what impact philanthropy could have around improving education in the most sort of disadvantaged contexts, and particularly places where, in a sense, there's been that results have been stuck for some time, and there's sort of long-term challenges, that are feeding that. And through that, partnership was born, which was really about trying to see education in its broader context. So what's going on in the community, what's happening in families, and what's then happening in schools, and trying to, if you like, sort of connect those three different circles together. And that's now 3 years into delivery. So it really started on the basis of a very comprehensive analysis of what was already happening in that community. What are the existing assets? What's the existing things that are happening well? What are the community saying about what's needed, and what their experiences of receiving those services? I think there was a clear sense that there'd been a lot of initiatives over many years, some of which were funded for short term, some of which perhaps lasted longer, but not very much coordination perhaps between them, and a sense in which the community and residents of North Birkenhead didn't necessarily feel that they were being consulted or
They were
heard
slightly
in what they
imposed, weren't they?
needed.
I mean, I'm feeling this, I have to say, in Blackpool. I'm recoiling from it, actually. Just let the community give the support to the community. You know, there are experts in that community. If we could only harness them, you know, and allow them to work together, you know, I've had it. I don't want to, you know, as soon as somebody says, "Oh, we've got the," you know, particularly from, say, one of the government departments, I'm just thinking, "Oh, no, please don't do that. Don't do it." But what sort of impacts it had then, Fiona?
So far, they've done a sort of analysis this year on the children who've been through the program so far, and particularly in reading, which was one of the sort of key vulnerabilities that was identified. There was a head teacher I was talking to who had always known, she's a secondary head teacher in the area, and she'd always known that they had significant literacy barriers in their school. And of course, she'd had SATs results and so on. But as part of the program, they've done quite rigorous sort of individual level pupil testing to really understand what their data is showing them. And on entry to her secondary school, it turns out about 30% of her children have got a reading age of 5 or below, which means that as a school now, they're having to really think about what's the sort of teaching expertise that these children need, because we as a secondary school aren't really actually trained to do that. And how do we, so it's given them a much more, I guess, forensic understanding of their baseline and what some of the challenges are. And in reading particularly, they've seen a significant progress above similar cohorts of children in the Wirral and in terms of the sort of national data set and where that's moving. And I think a lot of that is to do with seeing the reading challenge as kind of part of something broader, which is what's going on for children at home and in the community as well as in school, and getting the schools together to kind of work on shared challenges rather than seeing it as a sort of school performance issue, I think has been a really, really powerful shift in terms of emphasis, because these schools are used to being at the bottom of every list. You know, they're always, you know, clobbered around, whether it's attendance, whether it's other sort of challenges. It's, you know, it's a local authority that's used to being under a huge amount of spotlight and scrutiny. And actually just that act of sort of coming together and saying, we all serve the children of this community, we all serve the children of North Birkenhead, and how do we as a group of professionals better respond to the needs of this community and better listen, if you like, around the services that they need. I think that in itself has been a really important, significant shift. And the final thing I'll just mention is that at the same time as this, the local authority have been incredibly brave, I think, in redesigning their services into the more sort of multidisciplinary team type of model. So rather than having several different people across the authority interacting with the same family on different issues, instead they've brought that under a single umbrella, which means that the family has got a single point of contact who's able to advocate and get them the support across all of the different aspects of what they face. And again, that came through really strongly in the feedback from the community in the first place, that actually they were finding lots of disconnected inputs, professionals who weren't talking to each other, and a sort of bureaucratic system of referrals that meant that you know, children who were not meeting thresholds for certain levels of support were actually getting a real lack of support, when actually getting ahead of those issues and intervening early is what families want, and it's also what works better for the children. So alongside the sort of work that's been going on around schools and the sort of reading attainment and behaviour and those sorts of things, there's also been this shift in terms of how the local authority is providing its services, which you know, seems like it's having an impact significantly in terms of stepping children down around referrals to children care services and so on, because they're working with families earlier before they reach that point of crisis.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, Well,
I would say historically, schools have been disconnected, haven't they, from social care, even apart from where individual children are accessing social workers, etc. The school itself has been a separate entity, and I just worry when you speak like that and say the local authority have done this and done that. How's that going to work with lots of multi-academy trusts unless they all choose to buy into that same thing?
I see. I was going to say a similar approach, Fiona, has been there's a meeting in early December because Blackpool Council have I really feel as though they're at that point now. So there's a sort of they've convened this meeting of senior sort of service leaders. But the issue there is, I think about 6 years ago, the council realised or pushed very hard that multi-academy trusts were in effect serving their children. And so in a way, the balance and the expectations that the council have of multi-academy trusts has shifted over those 6 years. So that in effect, the council now, they do hold multi-academy trust CEOs to account if they come into Blackpool, and in a way, I think it's not as if that they're in the past, multi-academy trust may well have rocked up and said, well, we're not really bothered. We would feel contaminated if we integrated our work into the local schools and into the local council. Well, I do know that happens in some neighbouring local authorities, but actually that's not the case in Blackpool. And I think it's all to do with the council's position and driving hard that relationship with some of those multi-academy trusts, of which some are massive.
Because the local authority is responsible for the education of the children in their authority, regardless of how they are.
Well, they're taught. But that's sort of like not.
It's not tough enough.
No,
the legislation isn't tough enough.
Yeah.
And I did read an article. I can't remember it, but it was certainly by the head of a large MAT, who was saying it's time local authorities were given that and the ability to say your MAT isn't working. We're going to move some schools out of it. And shift, saying he didn't particularly want local authorities to run MATs, but they should have overall responsibility for how well the MATs are running, which to me makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting, Fiona, because the work I did in Leeds and in Manchester and on the Wirral, but actually it was in Manchester where the Director of Children's Services used to have a 6-monthly meeting with me and used to push me really hard about, well, are the schools really improving as well as they ought to? There was a very different position. There was some in Stoke. I was in some of those local authorities, never invited to meet the Director of Children's Services, never held to account. But in Manchester, I certainly felt it, and they were really digging down deep into, fixed term exclusions, all that sort of stuff, really quite challenging conversation. Anyway,
I would say, Frank, the other thing about that is, and I'm not saying where this was, but I've seen the opposite, where a group of secondary academy heads have sort of wanted to engage with the local authority, and the Director for Children's Services not being humble enough to recognise that that's a big step in their thinking, and still have the kind of arrogant approach of this is what we're doing despite you kind of thing. So it's about both, I think, and coming to an agreement that the agreement's always the same. We're trying to do the best for the children, and you've got to keep coming back to that. That's what we're actually about, not a power struggle between people who've got titles that are different than they ever used to be.
Now, 20 minutes into the conversation, actually, I have to say, Fiona, these are the best chats. I mean, the what's caught your eye this week is really a framework, to sort of keep it under control, really. But Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, today actually, a letter's gone from the Institute of School Business Leadership, which is the School Business Managers Association, I think, or an association of sub-school business managers, to the Secretary of State for Education to say, what's going on with the finances, basically. And the phrase they've used is they've listed some undeniable truths, which is about pay rises for teachers, energy prices, etc., and some questions which I think are really good questions. The first one is she confident that the 0.5% uplift that was a guarantee will still be a guarantee, and is it enough? 0.5%. Well, I think the answer to that is a simple no. She asked what level of reserves they think that schools and academies should hold. Point out that holding a general figure of reserves, an aggregate one, isn't accurate. And there are lots of schools who will go into serious debt, not based on reckless spending, but based on the way their budgets are constructed. And finally was, are they evenly distributed? Which again, the answer is no to. So it'd be interesting to see if there's a reply to that. But to me, it was something when the business managers are saying, we need to do something because this is a real problem. And the phrase, I'm just looking for the phrase that they've come up with, which is something like, or technically insolvent by spring 2004. And that's talking about a lot of schools, not one or two, and academies and maintained schools. It's across the board. So something's got to move. And just the week or 2 weeks before, we're going to be told where the cuts are going to fall.
Well, I think the audit that's undertaken for multi-academy trusts each year has that, as is the case in most audits, is it a going concern?
Yeah.
Now that definition it actually depends a lot on interpretation by auditors, so there isn't a formula that they apply. So actually you could see a number of multi-academy trusts, auditors not willing to state that it is a going concern. And actually, because they're still affected by company law and charity law. So if a charity isn't a going concern, the Charity Commission are particularly interested in knowing, well, how's that going to be resolved? And in company law, there's liquidation. So I think there are some real challenges here. It's not just something you can let it hang there. I think there are some serious challenges for the government in terms of just filling that hole, even if it's just filling it, not swamping it, but just fill it, so it's something, I don't think it's something that can be ignored for any length of time, because they say by 2024, there'll be swathes of schools and trusts that are being liquidated.
Yeah. So effectively next March, when schools start to put the budgets together, they will have a really clear picture of the year after. I mean, a lot of schools do 3-year
They do that now,
anyway,
yeah.
And that's probably already showing deficits for 2023, I would have thought.
Yeah. Some was showing deficits this year, weren't they?
Yeah. And with a 0.5% pay rise for teachers not funded.
And energy costs and
yeah.
Right, Fiona, what's caught your eye?
Cheered everybody up.
I know. Yeah. I thought we were on a sort of bit of a negative line this week. But anyway, go on, Fiona. Try and lift us. I don't think you can.
Yeah, I think it's tough. It's a tough job. I think just building on what Stan was saying actually there. I think there's, to me, I guess we've been prepped, pretty thoroughly now that there's tough choices and so on, and whatever people's view is on that. Fundamentally, it's about priorities, and something I've been thinking about a lot, and it relates to the thing that's kind of I guess struck me this week in terms of the news, is the extent to which, by protecting funding for services like the NHS, and at the same time discussing cuts to education. I think there was a quote, certainly a headline, about the new education secretary basically saying that in tackling inflation is much more important than tackling the school funding crisis. That really by doing that, with sort of ever more transferring priority and resource to mostly older people who are reliant on the NHS and away from children at a time when you've got growing intergenerational inequalities, and as part of that, there's been some research in the Child Poverty Action Group that I saw this week, which was about a cohort of roughly 800,000 children who are just above the threshold currently for free school meals, but who are absolutely below the poverty line, and where hunger and nutrition is a real problem. And as Stan was describing, the financial pressures on schools, schools are therefore less able to respond to that need by, for example, providing that additional resource, which they perhaps might have been able to do historically, but with the mounting energy costs, the unfunded pay rise for teachers, and projecting deficits, that's really constraining the ability of schools to be able to respond to that need. So to me, there's a question of these, the children who are turning up to school hungry and have got then clearly very, very sort of early barriers to their learning. And at the same time, this funding crisis that's affecting schools. And to me, it's that perfect storm of growing need for the type of resource that schools, particularly in areas of disadvantage, need to be able to meet, and are actually in many cases quite well placed to meet, and at the same time shrinking budgets and capacity to do so. And the thing that my sort of 3 a.m. moment is really what happens then to those families? What are the consequences of this for children? And how is it possible to justify a situation where children yet again seem like they're at the bottom of the pecking order when it comes to it feels like there's a very vociferous, for example, lobby around defence spending, and there could be good arguments for that, and I'm not here to discuss whether the merits or otherwise of that, but when I think about children and the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on their life chances and the legacy of all of that, it really worries me that there are all these children whose needs are just not being met currently.
Yeah, I mean that chimes really with the point I'm covering this week, which is about the Edge Foundation produced their, I think it's an annual report, I think it is anyway, but a fairly regular report, should I say, that included the youth voice census outcomes. And a lot of the comments that came from particularly secondary age students was just this sense of being, forgotten. That actually the pandemic, has happened and it's had quite a devastating effect on some of them, but actually the system is not picking up on them. So their concerns are around the lack of sort of preparation for entering the workplace, and for those who are going to university, the census suggests that that schools are well placed to serve those. And let's be honest, sadly, some of those are going to come from the most wealthy families. But for those who don't pursue that route, we've got the report was saying, I think it's just over 45% of children had no work experience whatsoever. A lot of them feel as though that they've got some of the skills that business needs, but actually they're not quite sure whether they are because they've not had that interaction. And it was 30%, 36% who said they had it. And actually, worryingly, 15% weren't sure whether they'd had a work experience.
And what they've had was work experience.
Yeah. But in a way that the messages here are, they feel disconnected from opportunities. They feel let down by the careers education that they've had, and they've not had the opportunity to gain that work experience, which they value. But obviously, businesses are struggling to offer it. A number of them are struggling. A lot of them are sort of laying staff off or struggling to find people to fill vacancies. So, there's not a lot of capacity in the system to offer it. But again, going back, unless we as a nation, take that seriously, we will continue to have productivity issues that affect the income that the country can generate, which then make it more difficult to pay taxes at the level that will provide education and health services that we expect. And at the end of the day, no one seems, what Gillian Keegan was saying there, inflation's more important. Well, it might be today, but actually thinking about the next 5 years, I think you're just going to have a bigger problem, inflation problem further down the line, unless you address the education issues. So I do feel slightly, it's at times like this when I feel sometimes about to sort of finish. You feel as though you've fought the good fight, and actually you think, well, is it better for somebody else to step forward and do it now? And then you sort of think, well, who's going to do it? Because there's a lot of people out there are quite scared to put their head above the parapet. Sadly, you feel as though, well, you have a voice, for heaven's sake, use it. Don't walk away from the voice. Those vulnerable people, or even those head teachers and school leaders who really ought to stand up, but can't or won't.
No.
You feel as though, well, I've got to get in there and fight for them.
Yeah, it does get to that point, Frank, because I've been thinking that in the last few weeks, that it'd be much easier just to retire completely and lose interest, but you can't when you hear people say, well, dealing with inflation is more important than funding schools. But the two aren't. There's no comparison between
one
them.
will get you. One might get you elected,
yeah,
but it won't help the country.
Mm.
And one is a result of the other.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that head above the parapet thing. I think what the healthcare sector do very well is make certain things untouchable. So no government ever is going to find it easy to make a public announcement that it's more important to tackle inflation than it is to reduce cancer rates, right? That's not something that would be politically palatable, whatever your standpoint and so on. And there's that, and I think there's something about children being somewhat sort of that there's not that inalienable right of a child. There's not that sense, I think, that actually like we as like adults like owe that generation more than they have actually had. And that sense, I think, Frank, of that like feeling like you're not a priority, feeling that your needs is just kind of not particularly valued, there's not really a space for that, and you might have a survey every few years and then no one's going to do anything with it. I think that's a really significant and genuine feeling among the generation.
What I would say though is last year, when the free school meals bit came, the country was not aligned with the government thinking, was it, in any way, shape or form? Big business even was saying, no, this is really important. And I think if the rhetoric is that children in schools, it doesn't really matter, I think there'll be a reaction to that. And politically, I think that's a dangerous game.
Well, I was heartened to finish this section on a positive note. I was part of a discussion with Lord Kenneth Baker this week. And this is a guy whose politics I don't always agree with, but actually I think, well, goodness me, if ever a man has committed his life to education, here it is. And he's significantly older than me. But actually what struck me was he held up a little sort of device about this big and said, this piece is of a car. It was designed for a car, and it's a sort of grey plastic piece. It was quite intricate. And he said, no human designed that. That's what AI can do. And he was saying, actually, we've got to think now about what are we teaching our children for? Where is it all heading? And his view was that actually we're still way back in our thinking about what the future looks like. And we need to be much braver to address these issues, because in effect, the AI element of it, will make life very different, for many, many people. For others, it will make no difference at all in a way. In some respects, some of those roles going forward will continue to be there. But actually, some roles are changing so rapidly. But in effect, we're not preparing young people for that change. And I think
saw that quote again, Frank, which is interesting in that if you take someone who was working 100 years ago in a profession, teaching is the only profession that could recognize how it was working and what they were using. The only difference potentially is a whiteboard as opposed to a blackboard.
Yeah.
Imagine a doctor from 100 years going into a modern operating theatre, or a pilot from Tiger Moth going into an airline. Yet in teaching, they could walk into the classroom and still recognise the basics.
Well, hopefully we're not going back to the monitorial system, but who knows? Fiona, what's called your room 101?
So my room 101 is So I'm a working mum, so I work 4 days a week and I have a childcare day on a Wednesday. And I would put into room 101 anyone who at any stage asks me or refers to my day off. Anyone who has experience of sort of childcare would know that it is anything but a day off. And I think it's sort of part of how we uh don't sort of value enough and don't recognize the significant work that goes into childcare. And I think it's for me, it's sort of a tip of the iceberg type issue, but I would definitely put into room 101 the day off
Yes.
sort of characterization of people, parents who are juggling childcare responsibilities alongside part-time work.
Brilliant.
Good enough, yeah.
Yeah.
But Frank and I can see this now, me only recently, but from a next generation point of view, and the exhausting nature of a child for a day.
I mean, honestly, I Monday, Tuesday, when we have childcare for the whole day, I'm absolutely shattered at the end of it, you know. And people and I try and sort of just do an email here or there, but then they're in there with me, you know. And I see these guitars that they never get. They're always out of tune. They're always, you know, and then I find them on the floor. But it's an absolute joy. It is a joy.
Yeah, I was going to say, even as a parent, I used to be able to say, you know, give me 200 children in an assembly hall, far better and far easier than my 2 at home on a rainy day.
Oh, well, okay. Well, thanks for joining us, Fiona. It's been a great chat, and there has been sadly, a bit of a theme to it, but it's where we're at the moment, and I hope those that have listened and watched have enjoyed it. And we'll be back next week with a new guest, and hopefully 126th edition. We thought we'd never get to 2, but anyway, here we are. So thank you, and we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much.